All right, we're gonna get started here. I know that it's standing room only, and I apologize, but Anthony is very popular. Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Wolf. I'm the programming coordinator for the Osterville Village Library. And thank you all for joining us, and thank you for those who are joining us on Zoom. We're very happy to have you. We're excited to have with us world-renowned. He loves it when I say that. World-renowned author and historian, and also local, and generous friend to the library, Anthony Sammarco, who will walk us through an exciting talk on molasses from the slave trade to the Great Flood. So without further ado, Anthony Sammarco.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you all for coming out on a Saturday afternoon. But I also want to say that I was very pleased that one of my college friends, high school friends, it's even worse, high school friends is here, Steve Hughes, somebody that not only honored me by coming, but I was doubly pleased that he didn't have a cane or a walker. I think it's sometimes our 50th high school reunion is coming up, and we went to an all boys high school in Boston. And I think sometimes it's really quite an interesting thing to see how a person might have evolved over the last 5 decades. Well, this is a lecture on molasses, and I bet everyone here has some sort of a jar of molasses on the kitchen shelf. It's a staple. But in a lot of ways, about 25 years ago, a woman at the Lower Mills branch of the Boston Public Library said, "Could I do a lecture on molasses?" I said, "Why?" And at that point, I realized it had a much more impactful history on the United States than one might realize. And seen here with a little jar of grandma's molasses, molasses is a thick syrup produced during the refining of sugar or from sorghum, varying from light to dark brown in color. Molasses is related from the refining of sugarcane or sugar beet juice into sugar. And molasses varies in the amount of sugar, the method of extraction, and the age of the plant. Sugarcane molasses is usually used to sweeten and flavor foods, and molasses is a major constituent of fine commercial brown sugar. But molasses is something that was so important that in the 17th and 18th century, it was part of the triangle trade between not only North and South America, Europe, and Africa. And seen here, one would actually see slaves being brought from Africa to the West Indies and the Caribbean, later, of course, what is now America, as well as from there, rum and sugar back to Britain and back. This was a huge impact on the world trade economy and affected almost every nation. But the concept was that slave trading would take place even in the 15th and 16th century in what is Western Africa. This is an 18th century map that actually shows the Guinea coast, also known as the Gold Coast or the Ivory Coast. During that period of time, this was a place that would have individual tribes living in areas that might be anywhere from 350 to 500 people, seniors, adults, young adults, and children. But by the period of the 16th century, many Portuguese and Dutch traders began to look at this as an area that not only had many people, but it was something that other rival tribes would descend upon these tribe inhabitants and not only subjugate them, but sell them into slavery. This is a typical tribe village that would be in a print of the early part of the 18th century. But once they would descend, seen here with initially bows and arrows and later with guns, that by the 17th century, in order to satisfy European demand, African slave raiders needed more captives to sell as slaves to the Europeans. And that necessitated starting and expanding more raids and subsequently wars to obtain them. And seen here, many people would actually be marched, not only with neck braces, but leg braces, anywhere from 5 to 10 miles to the coast. And in 1518, the King of Spain, Charles I, issued a charter authorizing the transportation of slaves direct from Africa to the Americas. Up to that point, since at least 1510, African slaves had usually been transported to Spain or Portugal and then transshipped to the Caribbean. In that way, it included, as you can see here, everyone that would survive the attack. Many people did die during the attack. Others died because of exposure or shock on the trek to the coast. But the whole aspect was, it was only at the coast that they would finally see Western Europeans. The transatlantic slave trade involved the purchase by Europeans of enslaved men, women, and children from Africa, and their transportation to the Americas, where they were sold for profit. Between 1517 and 1867, about 12.5 million Africans began the Middle Passage across the Atlantic, enduring cruel treatment, disease, and paralyzing fear aboard slave ships. And these slave ships were things that would actually be located in the harbor off of Africa. The Dutch and the Portuguese would actually start in the 16th and 17th century with ships that would hold anywhere from 200 to 300 enslaved Africans. And during that period, they would grow tremendously because in that instance, people began to realize that slavery was something that not only produced a profit, but it was also something that many agricultural communities could no longer survive without. After they had been taken on longboats to the ship, they'd be placed into the board or cargo hold of a slave ship. And then we'd see in some ways that many people that were human beings were deemed cargo. This is a French lithograph that was done about 1800, and it shows not only the plans of the cargo ship, and we can see on the left-hand side, 2 decks that actually have wooden barrels that could be everything from molasses to sugar to even grain. But you might see on the third one from the left, it's actually human cargo. These were how slaves were transported. And in this instance, many of them, beginning in the 17th century, would be chained for the 8 to 10 weeks, crossing from Africa to the West Indies or the Caribbean. Many were actually manacled, and you can see the manacles on the left-hand side. This was an important feature because any of us that were enslaved would probably react the same way many of these people did. The only aspect here was that many people realized that the condition of the slaves on leaving the brig Echo, and this is the ship Echo, was painful and disgusting in the extreme. They had been huddled together closer than cattle and slept at night in close contact as spoons when packed together. Privation of every kind, coupled with disease, had reduced all of them to the merest skeletons and to such a state of destitute and debility that on entering the fort, they could not so much as step over a small beam, 1 foot high in the doorway, but were compelled to sit on it and balance themselves over. It is impossible for you to imagine their sad and distressed condition. And in that way, even the United States would actually regulate the slave trade. This is a piece from the period of 1797, and at the top it says the stowage of the ship Brooks under the regulated slave trade. This was something that was done in conjunction between the United States and England, and as you can see, each of the individual aspects of the ship would actually have slaves. It was something in some ways that we realized that many of these people had come from various tribes. The linguistics was difficult because the dialects were different. But seen here, and this is the cargo hold, a man in the center reaches up for a basin of water. These people would usually be fed oil and gruel, something that at least sustained them, along with water. They had no time whatsoever on the deck. And in that way, by the time they began to arrive in the Caribbean and the West Indies, seen here, they would be huddled on the deck. They would be washed with salt water, oiled, and fed a little bit more nutritious gruel. The better they looked, the more money they would bring. And in that instance, the slave auction was something that was a major feature, not just in Europe, not just in the Caribbean and the West Indies, but also in America. And seeing here a map of the West Indies in the early part of the 18th century, we see Florida at the very top. We see Cuba, Santo Domingo, the islands, and the idea is even the northern part of South America at the bottom. This was an important feature because even in the 15th and 16th century, plantations were being laid out, some of which grew fruit, others grew sugarcane. And seen here is a plantation, and it's a print of about 1800, and it says that once sugar and other export crops began to be cultivated in the Americas, nearly every Western European country participated in the transatlantic slave trade. To secure full cargoes, European traders built castles or factories at ports on the coast where they could collect people and goods for sale. These sites, like the places at Goree, Cape Coast Castle, and Ouida, became launching points for European colonization. As these people came, they would then live on these enormous plantations. And the concept was they would be trained by people that had been there for one generation or five before them. And of course, sugarcane was big business. Sugarcane, and this is a print of 1823, shows the people staking out sugarcane. Now, we've all been to tropical markets, or not only in Boston, but also in the Caribbean. Sugarcane is something that looks like bamboo, but it actually could be put into the ground and sprout. During this period, it had 2 ripenings annually, and this was a major feature. They were set out in little squares, 36 by 36 inches. The very center was a piece of sugarcane that would then grow anywhere from 6 to 8 feet in height. It also had to be cultivated over that 6-month period. And here you can see the squares on the upper right-hand side, along with the aspect of continual cultivation, watering, nurturing, because this was a cash crop. During the 19th century, this was something that would actually produce not just molasses, but the refined brown sugar and the ultra-refined white sugar. And by many times in that period, everyone would come out for the harvest. As you can see, again, in 1823, this print shows the sugarcane crop 8 to 10 feet in height. It's being cut with scythes, and he realized it wasn't just the slaves, it was even the masters' families. This was big business, and the pieces themselves would then be cut into anywhere from 3 to 4 feet in length and taken by either a cow or a horse-drawn wagon to the sugar house. But during that period, this was something that many people just felt was part of life in the Caribbean. It said cutting down. Now comes merry time. Negroes all alive. Down we cut the canes, suck the juice and thrive. Mule grow fat as hog, though much work he bear. Horse and cow grow fat, starving is no there. It really was something that produced not only a great crop, but it was also the fact people were rewarded by actually participating in the harvest. And in the mid-17th century, British-owned Barbados rapidly developed into a slave society growing sugar cane. The capital and technology supplied by the Dutch were instrumental in bringing this about, unleashing a revolution in the production of sugarcane, with the essential ingredient being the Dutch supply of African slaves. One sees an African slave with, of course, the sugar cane, and we see a small 19th century horticultural etching showing the thickness of the sugar cane itself. But the whole aspect was, it started its refining process in the sugar house. From what I've read, the sugar house was always run by an elderly African slave woman. She always had control, not only for the production, but the workers themselves. This was something introduced by the Dutch, and you can see a very simple windmill that would actually turn, thanks to the wind, the grist mill that would grind the sugar cane into a pulp. Now, in some instances, if there was no wind, many people would actually have to turn the wheel, as we see in the upper left-hand side. This would then produce that rough ground sugar cane that would then be placed on the left-hand side into cauldrons, where it would be boiled until the sweetness was extracted from the sugar cane. It would be skimmed off and placed into the terracotta urns, and then basically allowed to cool before the refining process took place. But this print probably dates to about 1765, shows not just the pieces of sugarcane on the right-hand side, but also the men carrying away the cool terracotta pots of that sweet substance that would become molasses. Once the molasses was produced, which was continually stirring it over a low flame, that sulfured molasses would then be put into wooden barrels. Now, a wooden barrel that held any contents of 40 pounds would be called a hogshead. And these were hogsheads of molasses that weighed anywhere from 800 to 900 pounds. It was a very dense substance. These slaves would push these barrels from the sugar house all the way to the edge of the harbor, where they would be placed into small longboats. Slaves arduously load hogsheads or barrels filled with molasses onto a small boat called a drogher to be transported to the larger ship sitting in the harbor of St. John's in Antigua. And at that point, it would be sent to the ports, not only in the Caribbean, but also in New England. Because during the period of the 18th century, the area known as the colonial area, rum was by far the drink of choice in Boston due to easy access at an affordable price. Rum, along with punch, was a strong staple on menus in taverns throughout the colonies. And by one estimate, colonists consumed 3.7 gallons annually per head by the time of the American Revolution. I've never touched it since that one time that I couldn't find my car. Due to several factors, including the increased enforcement of tax on molasses, which increased the price, along with the westward expansion, it was much easier to grow corn for whiskey than ship molasses barrels of wagons. Rum's popularity eventually began to decrease. But seen here, a man of the colonial period pours a dram of rum from a stoneware jug. This was typical, but you had to realize Boston had 32 rum distilleries within 15 miles of the city in any direction. And during that period, one of the most profitable ones was Daniel Lawrence and Son in Medford Square, Medford, Massachusetts. Seen here in the foreground, it was called Ship Avenue until 1893, when all of these buildings were demolished to make way for Medford Square and renamed Riverside Avenue because it paralleled the Mystic River. The Lawrences were an old Medford family. Medford had been settled in 1630, and during that period in the 18th century, they started a distillery of rum. And the rum utilized molasses for a much more smooth drink. And during that period, Daniel Lawrence and Sons not only made a fine rum, which they called Medford rum, but it even had a vintage. And seen here, this was Extra 1870, and it was sold by S.S. Pearson Company. We'd realize in that instance, not only was Lawrence's Medford rum delicious, but it took 3 years to actually age. And during that period of time, it was called the best rum in the States. And in that instance, it was inherited by this man, Samuel Crocker Lawrence. He was the first mayor of the city of Medford, colonel of the Lawrence Light Guard, and founder of the hospital in Medford that bears his name, the Lawrence Memorial Hospital. But Medford had been a town. And in 1882, when they decided they would actually become a municipality, Samuel Crocker Lawrence wanted to be the first mayor. If you were anything like my mother, you would always hear the adage, it was liquor money. And of course, he did have liquor money. And he sold the mills at that point and development would take place. And he did become the first mayor. And Medford rum is still produced to this day, but not by the Lawrence family. Well, in the 18th century, it wasn't just rum that was popular, but slavery existed. Slavery had been known in Boston since 1637. Many of the African slaves lived on what was called Guinea Hill. Guinea Hill today is called Copp's Hill in Boston's North End. And the Guinea is not a diminutive of Italian Americans, but it's actually the Guinea coast of Africa. Slaves were sold in Boston right through to 1780. These advertisements would appear in the local newspaper. And it says here in 1767, to be sold on Thursday, the 3rd day of August next, a cargo of 94 prime healthy Negroes, consisting of 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls, just arrived from Sierra Leone. This was an important feature because there was a slave auction in Boston, and surprisingly, it was directly behind Faneuil Hall, a place today we call the Cradle of Liberty. Well, Faneuil Hall was actually a town dock. And the idea is Dock Square would actually be the area directly to the left of Faneuil Hall. I love it when I'm passing Boston City Hall on a meeting or something of that sort, and I say Dock Square entrance. I think I'm one of the few people that knows that it's called Dock Square. But Faneuil Hall was directly on the edge of Boston Harbor. It was built in 1742 by James Smibert, and it was actually funded by Peter Faneuil. And during this period of time, when he gave it to the people of Boston, it was actually to have a market on the ground floor and a meeting space directly above. But Peter Faneuil was one of the wealthiest merchants in Boston, but he wasn't born here. He was born in France. During that period of time, the Edict of Nantes was revoked in 1689, and King Louis XIV decreed that if you were to live in France, you had to become a Roman Catholic. And because they were Protestant and they were called Huguenots, they actually left France and they went to England, they went to the United States and many other places. And in this portrait, again, a wonderful painting by Smibert, he was not just an architect, he was an artist. It shows him as a wealthy merchant of the time. Well, when people say that one was a merchant, you assume they were importing fine French wine, linens, lace, ribbons. But half of Faneuil's wealth was derived from the slave trade. And we saw not just slaves in his house on Beacon Hill, but we saw that probably over his lifetime, he would auction over 1,100 slaves brought from Africa. And seeing here these advertisements, and this is 1772 at the height of the revolution. It says to be sold on the ship Bank Island on Tuesday, the 6th of May, 1772. About 250 fine, healthy Negroes just arrived from the Windward and Rice Coast. The utmost care has already been taken and shall be continued to keep them free from the least danger of being infected with the smallpox, no boat having been on board, and all other communication with people from Charlestown prevented. Smallpox didn't care if you were Peter Faneuil or a slave being brought from Africa. But the problem was, these enslaved people were cargo, and they were to be auctioned for a profit. So you didn't want anything that would mar their skin and, of course, decrease their value. Well, during that period of time, many people had slaves. Probably all of the wealthy in New England had at least one or two. But this is Isaac Royal Jr. and his family. His father, Isaac Royal, had been born in Dorchester in 1694, and though he was born into penury, he would go to the island of Antigua, and by the 18th century, return to New England in 1737, a millionaire. His son, who was educated at Harvard, would actually be well connected. His wife, just to his left, was Mary Brown, a very wealthy woman from Providence, Rhode Island, whose family would found Brown University. And on the far left is his sister Penelope Royal, who became Mrs. Henry Vassall, and her house still stands on Brattle Street in Cambridge. Well, this was the typical wealthy family of that period, and we began to realize that when they returned from Antigua in 1737, they brought 40 slaves with them. And in that instance, the house, which is today a historic house museum called the Isaac Royal House, not only shows the great wealth of a 12-room house, but on the right-hand side, the slave quarters, the only known slave quarters north of the Mason-Dixon line. In that instance, this was where not just the slaves lived, many of them lived in the house because they were house servants or personal slaves, but it was here that they tended to what was called 10 Hills Farm. It was 1,100 acres that encompassed Medford, Charlestown, and Somerville. And in that instance, Isaac Royal was somebody who was not just wealthy, but was probably one of the most prominent men in colonial Boston. Seen here, Isaac Royal Jr. was the largest slaveholder in 18th century Massachusetts. His wealth, primarily accrued through the enslaved labor in Antigua, made possible the creation of Harvard Law School. And of course, Royal and his father owned 64 slaves, eventually through matriculation, on the family's estate in today's Medford, Massachusetts. And seen here, he endowed the Royal Professorship of Law at Harvard with the 3 sheafs of wheat. It was recently rescinded, unfortunately. His wife was basically one of the wealthiest women. She was Elizabeth McIntosh Brown Royal, and she was 19 when she was wed in 1738. The marriage was advantageous, as both actually had great wealth and confirmed the royals' place in the colonial elite. These portraits that were done by John Singleton Copley, again, show a very wealthy couple, but it was their daughter's portrait that really was something that I've always loved. This is today in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It shows 2 young girls, 11 and 9. On the left was Mary Royal, and on the right was Penelope Royal. These 2 girls were highly marriageable. Mary did marry the Honorable John Irvin, and she did escape Boston and went to London. It later was the fact that her grandson was Lord Lyndhurst, who actually was the Treasury of Britain. And on the right, Penelope married Lord Pepperell of Maine. And though she died during the siege of Boston, this painting survived to show what slave wealth could actually produce for a family. Well, in this instance, one had to realize slavery would be abolished in Massachusetts in 1780. John Hancock, who served as the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, meaning the Commonwealth, every one of us, is something that decreed that every man was born free. And slavery, and the slavery of both African and Native American slaves, was ended. This is something that was incredible because New York did not abolish slavery until 1824. And of course, the Commonwealth in that instance would place on Beacon Hill the new Massachusetts State House. Designed by Charles Bulfinch, completed in 1798, it cost us $133,333.33. But it was the seat of what would become the Athens of America. Not only have they abolished slavery, but they advocated education and the aspect of learning. Boston would evolve in that period with many people, now second generation, that their ancestors had abolished slavery. And of course, Boston had a large African American population. Initially, as I mentioned, they lived on Guinea Hill on the north end. But by the early 19th century, they were living on the north slope of Beacon Hill, between roughly Revere Street to Cambridge Street, opposite Massachusetts General Hospital. And the first Black church in Boston was formed in 1805. Founded under the leadership of the Reverend Thomas Paul, the first African Baptist church built its meeting house on Smith Court and met there from 1806 to 1898, when it became a Jewish synagogue. The church became a major center of Black life and culture in the 1800s Boston, housing a school, and of course, serving as a gathering space for numerous community and abolitionist meetings. This was designed by Asher Benjamin, the successor to Charles Bulfinch, and was quite elegant and still survives to this day. But one had to realize that it wasn't just the people who had been freed from slavery. It was also by people that were rising and being known as abolitionists that Boston would become so well known. Abolitionism was something that had people who wanted to eradicate slavery in the entire United States, not just in Massachusetts. And they actually raised money through this to not only continue their publications and lectures, but also to buy the freedom of young babies in the American South, to bring them north and raise them as free citizens. Well, this is a little box. It says, "Remember your weekly pledge," a weekly collection box for Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, contributing according to their ability, 1, 2, or 6 cents a week in the box. The grassroots members of the movement could raise vast amounts of money with little seeming labor or sacrifice. And in that way, they realized that the slave auction, which had recently taken place in Boston but was abolished in 1780, was still continuing in the American South. And seen here, it's a conjectural painting that's done in the 1950s, but it shows a man, a woman, and a child on the auction block. Obviously, they're a family, but that didn't mean that they would be sold as a unit. They could be sold separately in three different aspects. It was thought immoral, it was thought it was unjust, and of course, they wanted to eradicate slavery. Well, one man came to the forefront, and he was a vociferous defender of the abolitionist movement. That was William Lloyd Garrison. Give you a little tidbit. His son, William Lloyd Garrison Jr., founded this library here in Osterville because they summered here. He said, I will be harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. And on this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. No, no. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse, and I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. And he was heard, not just in lectures before Bostonians, but in the publication of his paper, The Liberator. And this was something that would be published from 1831 until 1863 every Friday without fail. First published, as I say, on January 1st of 1831, The Liberator quickly became the preeminent abolitionist newspaper in the United States. Edited by the fiery activist William Lloyd Garrison, this weekly Boston-based periodical served as a major platform to attack slavery and its supporters, inspire action, and promote equal rights for all. And as you can see in this instance, it's not just the risen Christ with the cross, because you realize in this instance, it's not only a religious, but a moral aspect. We realize that this was read not just in Boston, but even with seething Southerners. Even here, during that period, you had to realize, even though that slavery had been abolished, many people in Boston still might fear being sold into slavery. It says, of course, caution, colored people of Boston, one and all. You are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchman and police officer of Boston, for since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers. And they have already been actually employed in kidnapping, catching, and keeping slaves. Well, if you had gone to the store and you didn't have your papers that show that you were a free person of color, you could be simply taken off the street and sold into slavery. The one thing that they had was the color of their skin. So they were easily demarked. And in that instance, people realized that this was happening all across the United States because there was actually a road to freedom to the north. And we saw many people realizing in some ways that that was something that would be lectured by many Bostonians. Many people coming to Boston realized, yes, it was the Athens of America. Yes, it promoted education, but it also continually extolled the virtues of the person being free. Well, seen here, this is Wendell Phillips. Not only was he educated at Harvard, but he was the seventh generation of his family to attend Harvard. His father, John Phillips, had been the first mayor of the city of Boston in 1822. He was a very wealthy man, and though he was trained as an attorney, he never practiced. As an orator, he was without compare. He's standing on the steps of the Boston Common, and he's lecturing to people about abolitionism. But if you look closely, it's both men and women, black and white, which was very unusual in the 19th century. And of course, he was so well respected as a Boston Brahmin, people did listen to him. But there was also Lucy Stone. She would also lecture not just on the rights of the slaves and the eradication of slavery, but she was also a women's rights activist. She was the first woman in Massachusetts to obtain a college degree. That was Oberlin in 1838. She was the first woman in America to maintain her maiden name after her marriage. She was the first female editor of a newspaper, the Women's Journal, in 1871. And upon her death, she was the first person, not woman, to be cremated in New England. During that period, she was somebody who basically did not allow ladies to speak in public, but she would lecture throughout New England about women's rights as well as the slave issues. But there was a very wealthy man in Boston who was actually diametrically exposing, in some ways, the evil between the people who wanted slavery and the abolitionists. And that was Abbott Lawrence. Now, he's seated in his drawing room, which is now the Union Club on Beacon Hill. He has a dressing gown and a mameluke. It's a very fashionable thing in the 1850s. But he was a prominent Boston businessman, politician, and philanthropist. And he was among a group of industrialists that founded a settlement on the Merrimack River that would later be named for him, Lawrence, Massachusetts. A. Lawrence and Company continued until Amos's death in 1855 and became the greatest wholesale mercantile house in the United States. And it was successful even in the hard times of the War of 1812, from 1812 to 1815. He did transfer his great wealth derived from the China trade into the manufacturing industries that would take over the economy of New England in the 18 teens and 20s. And seen here, the Merrimack Manufacturing Company would not only, since 1822, produce bolts of cotton, and I bet everyone here has something made of cotton, but it actually rivaled European imports. During the War of 1812, when our ports were blockaded, we could not get cotton from England or France. But in this instance, now, Lawrence was being quite successful, and his family, who was also the Lowells, created these cotton factories. But it seemed a dichotomy. We knew that we needed cotton. It was made for everything from tablecloths, napkins, dresses, undergarments. But where did the cotton come from? Come on, give me an answer. Oh, very good. Who picked the cotton? So it's being sent north, but you're an abolitionist, but you're wearing cotton and it's picked by slaves in the South. What do? It's funding the economy. It's basically giving us an income and a living. But the problem was in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, most of these mills were run by young women from the New England states, and they were from 15 to 35 years of age. And of course, they worked in the cotton mills in Lowell, Lawrence, and Chicopee. And seeing here a photograph on the right-hand side, many of these women spent an average of 4 years, usually saving enough money so they could be married and set up a house. But the whole concept was, after that period, it was primarily immigrants. But because of the dichotomy of people looking at cotton as something that could be viewed in two different manners, people realized that this was something that was actually bringing it to a head. It wasn't just the fact of cotton, it was also the fact that Harriet Beecher Stowe had written a book that was incendiary. It was Uncle Tom's Cabin, Life Among the Lowly. Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe was a very religious woman. You can see a cross at her throat. Her father was a Unitarian minister. Her husband was a Unitarian minister. Her 2 brothers were Unitarian ministers, and her son became a Unitarian minister. It must have been a fun group. But the whole idea was she wrote a book that put the face onto slavery. And Uncle Tom's Cabin tells the story of Tom, an honorable, unselfish slave who's taken from his wife and children to be sold at auction. And on a transport ship, he saves the life of Eva, a white girl, blonde and blue-eyed, of course, from a wealthy family. Eva's father purchases Tom, and Tom and Eva become good friends. Well, the story went on and on. During that period of time, this was something that was read voraciously throughout the United States. It was said to have sold 240,000 copies in its first year. I have books for sale, by the way. But the whole idea was everyone knew about it. And here is Abraham Lincoln. And in regard to the book, Southerners stubbornly held tight to their belief that slavery was an economic necessity, and enslaved people were inferior people, incapable of taking care of themselves. Well, Abraham Lincoln said upon meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe at the White House in 1862, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." It did. And by doing that, in many instances, it brought a more intellectual approach to this entire situation. When new states would come to the Union, they were either free states or slave states, and it had to be done on an equal basis. And many people said it was wrong, and it was. Well, during that period of time, not only did the Union enter into a war against the Confederate states that had seceded from the Union, the Civil War would happen. Many people think the Civil War was actually fought to free the slaves in the South. It was not. The Civil War was actually waged to preserve the Union. And seen here was a young man, Robert Gould Shaw. His family did have a house on Beacon Hill, but his family's horse farm was in what is today West Roxbury. During that period of time, they were among the most wealthy of the Boston Brahmins. A month after his graduation from Harvard College, he was commissioned as colonel of Company 54. And Company 54, which you might remember the movie Glory, was something that was an all-black regiment. And that black regiment was composed of people that were doctors, lawyers, as well as, of course, working men. And in that instance, they would enter into the war after having been trained at what was called Camp Meigs. Camp Meigs was in what was then Dedham, but today Reedville, because it would be annexed to Hyde Park in 1868. And seen here, it was named for Colonel Montgomery Meigs on the lower left-hand side. It didn't matter if you were white or black, you were trained at Camp Meigs for 8 weeks. And after their 8-week training, Colonel Shaw and his men were placed on a train at South Station and were taken south. There was huge difficulties, and many people did die. But the whole aspect was they recruited from people of all walks of life. And it says to colored men, 54th Regiment, Massachusetts Volunteers, men of African descent. They offered a $100 bounty, which is a huge sum of money, and they paid $13 a month as state aid for families. So they encouraged you to join. Well, seen on the right-hand side is William Carney, and he did join the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry in 1863 and was promoted to sergeant due to his heroism and actions during the Battle of Fort Wagner. He took part in the July 18th, 1863 assault on Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina, and his actions there ultimately earned him the Medal of Honor because he saved the American flag. It did not fall to the sandy beach. And today he's one of the many depicted in Augusta St. Gaudens's wonderful bronze relief in front of the Massachusetts State House, honoring not just Colonel Shaw, but the men of the 54th. Well, during that period of time, the war was decisive. There was a win or a loss on either side. But to subjugate the South, Abraham Lincoln would draft and sign the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, effectively freeing anyone held in slavery in the United States. And it undermined not only the American South, but the plantations that needed the slaves to continue their agricultural and, of course, cotton growth were decimated. And in that instance, when the war ended, Abraham Lincoln lost his life. And we realized in that instance that the abolitionists, who were the descendants of the Massachusetts people that had freed all people of slavery in 1780, had effectively won their cause. And here the abolitionists would meet at Lucy Stone's house on Pope's Hill in Dorchester. She's seated on the back with a white lace veil and ruff at her throat. Her husband is on the right, standing in front of a column with a beard. And the rest were members of the abolitionists of the 1830s to the 1860s. The man on the left-hand side, seated on the porch against the column, is William Lloyd Garrison, Jr., who founded the Osterville Library. The third part of this lecture is about the North End. And the North End, which is a neighborhood of the city of Boston, was again settled in 1630. This is a map that was done by my great-grandfather, James Mitchell, and it shows Boston and the surrounding areas of Cambridge, East Boston, Charlestown, Lower part, South Boston, Roxbury, and Dorchester. Boston was an 800-acre peninsula connected to the mainland at Roxbury by a neck. And seen here, just prior to 1860, the south end had already been infilled and the back bay was envisioned as a 550-acre area of upscale housing. Boston was changing, and it was changing primarily because there were many immigrants coming to the city of Boston. In the 1840s, the Irish came because of famine. In the 1850s, the Germans came because, of course, the economic conditions of Germany at the time. In the 1860s, Jews from Poland and Russia began to come, as well as Italians in the latter part of the 19th century. It was said that the North End by 1900 had 21 different languages and dialects spoken. And one person who exemplifies that is Apollos Revere. This is a fascinating story. This is Paul Revere as we know him. He was Paul Revere Jr., the son of Paul Revere Sr., and they were silversmiths, but they were Huguenots, just like Peter Faneuil. And when his father came to the New World, granted he married a woman who was descended from the Puritans, but he baptized his son Apollos Revere, who would later anglicize his name. And seen here, this silversmith, goldsmith, copperplate engraver, dentist, as well as belt caster, would be one of the most prominent men in Boston. And during that period, he was exemplifying in some ways the aspect of immigrants coming to the city in the 19th century. He made some legendary silver. And if you're thinking for a Valentine's Day present for me, this would be fine. I'll even take a spoon. But this is in the collection of the Worcester Art Museum. Great example of a tea service, but not everybody could afford this, probably fewer than 2% of Boston's population in 1800. But Revere was somebody in some ways that was the man who called that the British were coming. But you had to realize in that instance that he was among many of us who descend from the immigrants, whether it was the Puritans from England in 1630, or even someone in the recent past. And here, in a sculpture by Cyrus Dallin, Paul Revere is riding his horse Meg. And this is something that was placed on the Prado in 1937, and one sees the spire of the Old North Church, or Christ Church Episcopal, where the two lanterns were actually hung. During that period of time, the North End would change. And what had once been the home of not just the royal governors and wealthy merchants, as well as artisans, we began to see in the 1840s clipper ships bringing new arrivals to Boston. During that period, Donald Mackay had been building many ships, not just for Cunard Line, but also Train Line, owned by Enoch Train of Dorchester. And these were ships that went from Liverpool to Boston, sometimes with cabin passengers, but primarily with steerage passengers seeking a better life in the United States. And in that way, they would arrive, so much so that by the 1850s, it was said that just in 1 month, June of 1860, 10,000 new arrivals arrived in Boston. This is Robert Salmon's painting of Boston Harbor. And you can imagine the number of ships that were here. They weren't just cargo ships trading with foreign ports. They were also passenger ships that were bringing people to the New World. Granted, not everybody stayed in Boston. Many people would actually go to the Midwest. But in this instance, the North End became an area of the immigrants. And by the latter part of the 19th century, it was called Little Italy. This is a postcard from 1905 that shows all men. I always wondered what it meant. What you had to realize is these were men who came to actually work here and travel back and forth from Italy to Boston. The men on the left stand, but the men on the right sit on the curbstone. They're in front of the Banca Ettore Fiori, which is the Italian credit union, where they could wire money back to Italy for their mothers or wives or children. The North End by this period was a very diverse community. Many Jews would have shuls and temples. The Italians would have Sacred Heart and St. Leonard's, and the Irish St. Mary's. But there'd also be Portuguese churches and various schools. Well, in that instance, many of the buildings that had survived from the colonial period would be repurposed. This was Paul Revere's house. And when it was built in 1680, it survived. It was 3 stories in height. Paul Revere had married twice. With his first wife, he had 8 children. After her death, he married again and had 8 further children. He also kept 7 to 10 silversmith apprentices. So 21 people lived in this house at any given time. But by 1895, it was the Banca Italiana, where you could actually do your banking in your native tongue, as well as the Gaududi cigar factory, that had employment for many women to roll hand-rolled cigars. Well, during that period, the North End would change, and in some ways we saw the remnants of even here, the Thoreau House, built in 1727 on Prince Street. Very simple wood frame building, it's seen better days, but this was the home in the early part of the 1880s of Levi Goldman. Seen in the doorway, by this point, he had moved to Elm Hill Avenue in Roxbury, which were wonderful houses. But here he had a redemption center, and he was a dealer in paper goods, metal, stock, glass, and he would actually redeem it for many people. So whether it was Paul Revere's house or Henry Thoreau's family house, we saw the remnants of the North End becoming in some ways a very different neighborhood. And even here, Salem Street, one of the original streets of Boston, has a sign, which is a sign that's for Shabbat, that actually says prayer shawls and prayer books are available in that store. Salem Street has not changed very much from what it is today. But by the early part of the 20th century, it had over 71,000 people in less than 6 acres. And in that way, we realized that these buildings that had survived from the 18th and early 19th century would be demolished. Now, I want you to look closely at this photograph. We see in the distance Christ Church, which is its official name, but it's the Old North Church and the whole street in the foreground. And if you look, most of the buildings are wood covered in clapboarding. This is 1885. 1895, it's completely rebuilt with brick tenements. And tenements would be built in not only Boston's North End, South End, and West End, but a tenement apartment was usually 3 rooms. The center room would have a stove, the only heat that was in the apartment, and 2 other rooms, whether it was a bedroom and or a living room. And we'd see only 1 toilet per floor. There was also the fact the city would erect bathhouses in almost every part of the city of Boston, because they could actually go to the baths, hopefully more than once a week, but in this instance, they would actually have that ability. Well, the North End's density and population was something that we saw, that many people were always on the streets. And seen here is Commercial Street, and this is a photograph from 1910. And we see an elevated railway on the left-hand side. When I say the elevated railway, this is not the one that ran from Sullivan Square in Charlestown to Forest Hills and Jamaica Plain. This elevated ran from North Station to South Station. So if you were transferring from trains, it was quite convenient. But the Purity Distilling Company had a storage tank fermenting molasses, initially to create ethanol for World War I weapons, and it collapsed under pressure. And 2.3 million gallons of molasses went onto Commercial Street. The accident would cause 21 deaths, 150 injuries, and heavy damage. Well, the story was that Purity Distilling Company, which still survives today, and it's in Woburn, Massachusetts, had these enormous tanks. It was set on stilts that were actually 4 stories in height, and the tank was 4 stories in height. And because it was riveted metal, the rivets were never checked. And it was well known that the children of the North End would gather molasses because it was usable from the dripping seams of the tank. It was never checked by the sealer and weights and seals measure of the city of Boston. And by the period of 1919, it was something that many people said was destined for problems. Well, it exploded, and it was on January 19th of 1919. And here we see a conjectural, but I love it, picture of a policeman with the cascading molasses from the tank. Not only did the tank explode, but the molasses, which has a heavy density, was something that would actually go 40 miles an hour in any direction. And seen here, it would actually only take 5 minutes to not only cause the elevated line's girders, built of steel, to warp and bend, but also to wipe away all of the wooden shacks in the foreground. They were called the potato shacks or vegetable shacks, as well as displace the Marine Department of the Boston Fire Department on the right-hand side off of its foundation. Within minutes, the Red Cross and other people descended upon the scene. And seen here on the left-hand side, many of these people's feet could not be seen for the depth of the molasses. If you notice on the upper left-hand side, you see almost an accordion effect to the elevated railway. And it wasn't just the molasses that it caused it, it was everything they pushed that was within the line of the molasses flow. So buildings, not only tanks, but even cars and wagons would actually be destroyed. And by that point, we realized that seen here with the girders themselves, this was something that not only people could not comprehend, but the quickness of it. It had started in the early morning in Boston below freezing, and by noontime it was 60 degrees. The molasses swelled with the heat and caused the tank to explode. And people realized in that instance that it was something in some ways that many people could not have controlled the outcome. Dozens of horses died or had to be put down because, of course, broken bones. 21 people did die, 150 were injured. But in that instance, seen here looking towards Boston Harbor, which is today a baseball field, we see on the right-hand side the Marine Division of the Boston Fire Department, and of course, the remnants of all of these wooden shacks in the foreground. Something that took less than 5 minutes to cascade, and it took months to clean up. And we realize in that instance that the North End is more than just a neighborhood. Today, it's a tourist attraction, and people come to see Paul Revere's house. And this is how it appeared in 1907 after it was restored. Now try to put 21 people into that house. Well, Paul Revere is a major attraction, not just in American history, thanks to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, but is a great attraction on the Freedom Trail. And when we think of it, Grant Wood depicts the legendary story of the American patriot Paul Revere as learned from an 1863 poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And from a bird's eye view, the painting shows Revere on horseback racing through a colonial town square in Massachusetts. There's also the aspect of the Great Molasses Flood. And seen here with men standing on the aspect of the top of the elevated railway, you began to realize this became part of Boston's lore. And of course, today, the North End, that many people still think is an Italian-American community, but it's changed demographically tremendously in the last 2 decades, still has many hay markets, as well as meat markets, fish markets, and of course, the ubiquitous Mike's Pastry and Morton Pastry. Today, in some ways, the North End is a far different place than 1919 when the explosion of the molasses tank took place. But it all derives from molasses, derived from sugarcane, and placed into a jar that says Grandma's molasses. We might clean up a tablespoon or two that might spill onto our counter and say, my, how sticky. But 3.2 million gallons had once cascaded along the streets of Boston. It's become, in some ways, a great story for the city of Boston, an icon, so to speak. But today we remember that very nice jar of molasses. Thank you for coming.